Hi class. Today we're going to do lecture 3 on evaluating arguments. Just to review what we talked about in our last lecture about what an argument is in general. In this class we're talking about a conclusion backed up by premises, and those premises are supposed to provide evidence that the main point is correct. So in general what we're going to try to figure out today is whether an argument is successful at accomplishing this goal of providing evidence that the main point is correct, or whether it's not. And the main idea behind evaluating arguments is to figure out whether an argument is good or bad at accomplishing this specific goal. So just to do an overview of this lecture, first thing I'm going to do is distinguish between a bad way to evaluate arguments and a good way to evaluate arguments. And the reason I'm going to focus on this bad way is because it's a really common way that lots of people think about when they're evaluating arguments, but it's actually bad. I want to explain exactly why it's bad. Then we'll focus on the proper way to evaluate arguments from a philosophical perspective. And then we'll run through 5 examples, sample arguments, that we will try to evaluate. And just notice that sometimes on this lecture I'm going to shorten the word arguments to the word args on the page, just to because I sometimes get lazy writing out the entire word argument. It's not because I have a thing for pirates or anything, although there's Johnny Depp as a pirate in the corner just in case you have a thing for pirates. Alright, so let me talk about the bad way first. Notice the skull and crossbones. This is the bad method. This is not a good method for evaluating arguments, but it's really common. And the bad method is this, figuring out whether the conclusion is correct or incorrect. Well, why is this a bad way? Well, for starters, this completely ignores the premises and just focuses exclusively on the conclusion. So it's only evaluating an argument on a tiny part of that argument. It's like judging a movie just by watching the 5 minutes at the end of the movie. Well, to see whether the movie is overall good or bad, you should probably watch the entire movie. But more importantly, the reason this is bad is that this fails at addressing what an argument is supposed to accomplish. Arguments aren't supposed to merely provide you with truths. They're not supposed to just tell you what's true and what's false. Arguments are supposed to offer evidence why a conclusion is true. It's supposed to show you that a conclusion is true, not merely tell you. And so if all you do is jump to the conclusion itself and ask, well, do I believe it? Do I not believe it? You're ignoring the duty of an argument to, by itself, explain to you or show you why a conclusion is correct. So another thing I want to highlight is that arguments can be bad even if they have a true conclusion. There are many bad arguments out there that have true conclusions. So just because you give a thumbs up to the conclusion doesn't mean you should give a thumbs up to the entire argument overall. Here's just a really stupid example of a bad argument with a true conclusion. Premise 1, Terry lives in Ohio, therefore conclusion, I have 2 cats. That conclusion is true, I have 2 cats. They're occasionally jumping on me while I'm giving this lecture. But that premise that I've offered in support of it has nothing to do with the conclusion. Whether Terry lives in Ohio or not tells me nothing about whether I live in Ohio, or whether I have 2 cats, sorry. And one final note is that this is a bad method, but it is an incredibly common method, and that's why I wanted to talk about it right now, to try to set it aside as a bad method. We have this natural tendency, I'm getting into human psychology a little bit here, but lots of us have this natural tendency to judge first and evaluate later. That is, we just jump ahead to the conclusion of the argument, and if we agree with it, we go, hooray, this argument must be good, and if we disagree with the conclusion, we go, boo, this argument must be bad. So let me just give you an example of this. I'm about to give a really, really good argument that proves once and for all that there is a God. And so I don't know if you're going to be surprised by this. Maybe you don't know that there's really good evidence out there for this. But I want to show to you that yes, there is a divine creator of the world who cares for us. And here comes the argument. Are you ready? Here's my argument that absolutely proves that there is a God. Okay, I'm not actually going to give you an argument. What I wanted you to do, though, is think about how you were ready to hear that argument? How were you prepared when you came to that argument? Now, here's what I'm guessing happened. If you are already a believer in God, you were probably sitting up saying, "Ooh, here comes a good argument. I'm about to like this argument because I like the conclusion that Sean's about to say, so the argument for it must be really good." On the other hand, if you are an atheist, if you don't believe there's a God, you were probably scoffing before I even gave you that argument. You were saying, "Oh, here comes some bullshit. This isn't going to be right. I'm not going to buy this at all." And that is tapping into this natural tendency we have to judge first and evaluate later. I didn't offer any premises whatsoever. I just told you what the conclusion of my argument was before I offered any reasons in support of it. But you were already predisposed to either like or hate that argument. This is something that in philosophy we want to try to combat. We want to be a little bit more open-minded. We want to hopefully try to expand our perspective and try to openly listen to arguments for conclusions we disagree with, and also extend critical scrutiny towards arguments that have conclusions we already agree with. So we want to be equally critical of arguments with conclusions we like and arguments with conclusions we don't like. All right, so let's now turn to the good way. Yay, we've got a smiley face for this one. The good way is to judge an argument, like I said, based off the goal of the argument, whether the evidence actually supports the conclusion or not. So the good way is to figure out whether the premises are good enough evidence to rationally convince us that the conclusion is correct, whether the premises actually provide us with good evidence to support the claim that the conclusion is true. And the difference here between the good way and the bad way is not just telling us that the conclusion is true, or figuring out whether the conclusion is true or false. It's about whether the premises show us that the conclusion is true or false. That's a subtle but important difference. So let's talk now in a little bit more detail about this phrase, good enough evidence, because evaluating whether an argument's good or bad is going to come down to, at the end of the day, whether we have good enough evidence or not good enough evidence. So here are two important qualities of good evidence. Good evidence is always true. All the premises have to be correct. If you offer false or fake reasons in support of a conclusion, your argument is not going to be that good. But furthermore, good evidence also actually supports the conclusion. And supports is a bit of a metaphor here. I guess we're talking about this notion of logically supporting the conclusion. We'll be talking a lot more about this, both in the remainder of this lecture and in lecture number 4. But here's the general idea to get us started with what support means. All the premises combined should provide us with enough information for us to figure out that the conclusion is correct. We should be able to figure out from the premises alone, from the information in the premises alone, that the conclusion is correct. All right, so one thing I want to say is that these two qualities are completely independent of each other, and some arguments fail that truth test, and other arguments fail that support test. So here's an example of an argument that fails the truth test. I'm going to go back to the conclusion, my shoes are awesome. I seem to be obsessed with my shoes lately. Here's the example argument. My shoes are awesome because they're green, and all green shoes are awesome. Well, there's a problem with that argument. The problem is one of those premises is false. My shoes are not green. If you see the picture there, that's a black sneaker. That's the kind of color shoe that I have. So this argument fails the truth test. Other arguments fail the support test. And here's another example of a different argument for the same conclusion that fails the support test. My shoes are awesome because my name is Sean and I live in New Jersey. Well, both those premises are true. They don't give us any information, any support whatsoever for the claim that my shoes are awesome. In fact, they don't even talk about my shoes. They don't even talk about what it would be like for my shoes to be awesome. They provide us with no logical evidence at all. We don't have nearly enough information to figure out that my shoes are awesome. So that's this basic notion of support. It fails at bridging the gap logically between the conclusion and the premises.